it.
User. Same applies with social networks. You want to be on a social network that has the most users as opposed to ones that have fewer.
Oh, there we go. Cool. Yeah. Welcome everyone to our Startup Grind Boston Fireside Chat. Excited to have all of you here, and yeah, really excited for the discussion with David here tonight. So this is part of the funding month for Startup Grind. And if you're not familiar with our organization, we actually have, we started out in Silicon Valley 11 years ago now, and there's 500 chapters around the world spanning across 120 different countries. And this is a quick introduction that once I make sure I'm sharing the sound as well. You know, we're going to share from Startup Grind and from the partners or the global sponsor, American Express and Oracle for startups that are putting on Funding Month here. So just going to play this quick introduction for you.
Funding Month, presented with Oracle for Startups and American Express, recognizes the stories, lessons learned, and best practices shared by founders and funders around the world.
And we also have several local sponsors and partners, including, just checking here. Yeah, if Tyler is here yet, but basically, you know, one of our sponsors is Brex, which is a corporate credit card cash management system designed specifically for startups and started as founders basically having this problem themselves where they couldn't, you know, they had capital in the bank from investors and still couldn't get a credit card, and you know, decided to create a system for startups to be able to solve this process themselves. And then our other sponsor is ShipQuid, which is a platform designed to help you figure out who your ideal customer profile is and manage the in-depth aspects of a CRM sales team and get everybody on the same page while you're trying to target, you know, the personas you're going after for your business. And yeah, they have a lot of great tools and features and some more exciting updates coming out as well. Other partners, you know, include everything from like consulting, advisory, development groups, marketing and promotion, and really any startup services you need, other event groups as well. Definitely check out our startupgrind.com/Boston site. And if there's something you're looking for that's not there, you know, reach out to Yev, Jenny, or myself, and we're happy to make introductions and connect you with the right people there. Just, you know, for this fireside chat, it's going to be pretty conversational. I'm going to moderate with David, and would also like to include any of your questions as part of the conversation. So feel free to submit them through the chat, and we'll also save a little bit more time at the end for Q&A as well. And also, if anybody, you know, wants to introduce yourself, share what you're working on in the chat, or, you know, share your LinkedIn contacts, great way to connect there as well. But yeah, with that, you know, super excited for this. David, you know, comes at both sides, or I guess, you know, several different sides of the startup story here, from an entrepreneur to an operator, you know, having several of his companies that he's been CEO and founder of been acquired by large organizations, and now is an angel investor in 60 different startup companies, and also one of the founding members of the TBD Angels. So really excited for our conversation here. And yeah, would love to have you give a quick introduction, David, before we dive into the chat here.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me. I know this was supposed to be a fireside chat, and as you can tell, this is really the backseat of my car. So my apologies that it's not as picturesque as maybe where you're sitting, but glad to be here. As Jason mentioned, I'm an entrepreneur and angel investor. My quick background is I've been a part of 6 Boston-based companies, all in the tech space, generally software powered, both B2B and B2C. And during that time have worked with thousands of just amazing other entrepreneurs and operators. And some of the ventures that I've been part of on the B2C side, I was one of the early TripAdvisor employees. We were, I guess, about 30 people when I was there, and I led new product development there. And then on the B2B side, somewhat recently, I had sold a company to E-Trade, and that was a fintech in the student loan space. And then prior to that, had also been the head of the PayPal Boston office after our acquisition. So that's my entrepreneur side. And on the angel investor side, I've been angel investing for about a decade, have done just north of 60, maybe closer to 70 angel investments now. Typically really early stage companies. Many of the founders or folks that I may have known as part of different networks. A lot of them are based in Boston. And so it's just been great to, I hate to use the word give back, but it's essentially get back involved into early stage companies in a different sort of way. And so that's been just been a blast. And maybe I'll just round out the rest of what I'm up to. I do spend a fair bit of time working with student entrepreneurs these days, primarily at Babson, but also at HBS. And that's also been a blast, again, deep in the Boston ecosystem. So excited to be here.
Oh, amazing background there. And, yeah, now that you've been a part of, or, 6 startups from the ground up, plus all the ventures you've been involved in as an investor and advisor there as well. I guess starting back in your startup story, like, did you, on your first venture, or, can you tell us a little bit about what your first venture into entrepreneurship was? And did you have the mindset of like, this was going to be the one thing you're focused on, or did you always, think you were going to be a serial entrepreneur, from day one?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm just looking around at some of the other faces of the folks that are in the in the Zoom room, I guess is what you want to call this. But I was not. I consider myself, if anything, more of an accidental entrepreneur. I had spent 7 years working for a big company between undergraduate and grad school, and I loved it. I was building software. I got to work with really cool people. I had worked for the same boss for 7 years, which I think is somewhat unusual. And then when I went to business school, my whole thought was I would go back into working in tech for a big company. And it was only after meeting other people in the startup scene did I start to realize that there was just a different type of company that was out there, and kind of stepped into it by accident. By the time I was graduating, near the tail end of my 2 years at business school, I just started seeing a lot more interesting stuff at the early stage. And my very first company that I was involved with was about 100-person software company out in Natick, and I joined as a product manager as employee 101 or so. And so it was not a super early stage startup, but coming from a really big company, that felt really small, felt really tight. And so that was like that first experience. And then I gradually got smaller and smaller in terms of early stage work.
Sounds good. And then, yeah, some of them, you were, I guess, earlier on more of a founder role, and some you joined in there. The companies you decided to join and become a part of, like, what excited you to, or I guess, was there a common thread that would make you choose to go into one startup versus another?
Yeah. Today, I'd like to string together a story that's coherent from startup to startup and say that it was a very methodical choice of moving one to the next. But in reality, at every one of those junctures, it's a 51-49 kind of decision, right? And maybe the best example that I can give was after I had worked at that software company called eDocs, which was an enterprise software, I worked at TripAdvisor, and then my former boss at that first company was at a new company called MCube in the mobile space. And when he was telling me about the growth in the space, I'm like, fantastic, sounds really cool, get to work with you again. But I wasn't sure whether or not it was a great move for me. And I actually had called him to decline the offer and say, sounds awesome, but I think I'm just going to stick around. And I had rolled into his voicemail and never left in the message. And so by the time later that afternoon I returned the call, I had changed my mind, right? And so it just gives you a little bit of, it's an anecdote as to how chancy every one of these interactions were. And so had he picked up the phone, I would not have joined, right? And so every one of those is one of those things where, depending on luck and circumstance, like you end up in different places. And that was generally the case for me. And as I mentioned before, I could string together a really logical sequence of why I jumped from company to company, but there really wasn't. Like sometimes it was more about growth in terms of role, right? So the natural extension up the ladder. Sometimes it was lateral and picking up new responsibilities. Like when I went from product management to product marketing to marketing, that was lateral. And then I guess the common factor was that for every one of those, it was a team of folks that I was pretty happy to be part of. And so sometimes it was getting the old band back together, but other times it was meeting a brand new set of people. And I guess the common thread is that in every one of those cases, I did spend a fair bit of time trying to figure out whether or not the team was a group of people that I could work with, whether it was complementary skills or just vibe or just like common values, like all of those things. Spent a ton of time kicking the tires on, and then of course looking at the venture, making sure that it seemed reasonable and all that.
Right. No, that's super important. I mean, the team's the most important part, especially in the early stages and as you grow the startup venture. So yeah, you definitely, it's more than a regular job where you actually, day in and day out, it's it's what you breathe, and like the people you're working with, you have to be passionate about that group of people that you're working with as well. So no, I really like I really like what you said there. And
yeah. And it could be trite, right? I mean, like everyone says it's the team, but at the end of the day, most of what we do involves building stuff and selling stuff with other people. And if you can't find a team that you gel with and people that you gel with, then your life will be miserable. And so it just has to be at the top of the list.
Right. And so then, when you look at startups now, how are you judging or like trying to figure out, how either the team meshes together or how you mesh with the team? And is it a similar sort of way of figuring out like what you want to get involved in?
Yeah, it really is. In fact, the scorecard, if you can even call it that, or the rubric that I use in evaluating whether or not a startup is investment worthy, was largely born out of a one-page sheet that I used when I was interviewing companies to join. And so what I found was, this is going way back, but when I was back as a senior in college, you were talking to all these companies and I couldn't keep straight one versus another. And so I just had this one pager, and within a 30-minute interview, in addition to me answering questions, I'd want to find out certain things about the company. And when I'd walk away, that sheet should be filled out, right? And so there's nothing special about it, and I'm happy to share it. It's the company, the customer, the competition, the kind of classic, the C's of it's like the 5 C's and 4 P's of marketing, right? And so walking out, just had a really good sense. But it turned out that framework was one that was really helpful in terms of just figuring out whether or not a company was investment worthy. And I've since boiled it down a little bit, and so it's not as rigorous as having to fill out this long one-pager. But at the end of the day, it does really center upon 3 things. It's the people side, and maybe directly to answer your question, it's do we think those founders are tenacious? Do they have some sort of spark within them to keep moving, right? Because startups are all about challenges and overcoming those challenges. They don't have to be second-time founders, third-time founders, right? And so it's definitely, it helps if you know that they have a track record, but lots of first-time founders exhibit those skills. And so it's not about whether or not the team has done that before. And obviously if they have, then fantastic. And if they have and they've proven they can work with each other really well, even better, right? Because that's a whole bunch of risk that's just been run out of the system. So one characteristic of 3 is the team and composition and complementary skills and all that. The second one is around whether the product or solution, what they're building, there's something that is different about it, and different not just for different sake, but different that's good in the market. And so sometimes it could be a product differentiator, right? They've invented a better mousetrap, and so that could be it. And other times the product solution, they've just looked at the business differently. You know, ride sharing was a great example, right? Like the tech isn't differentiated, but the whole model is. And so that's the second piece to it. And then the final one is just whether or not the market, is there demand, is there potential demand? Can it be something big, like space-wise? Is it tackling a problem that can ultimately be something that is pretty large? And that problem solution fit has to be there. And so it does come down to the team, the product, and the market that they're in.
Did you ever share that scorecard with potential employers, or was that something you just kept, to yourself?
I kept it to myself. It was more of like a form that I filled out, and at the end of it, I found that most of the time I never actually graded it, but like by the time you got to the end, you kind of knew whether or not it was a fit or not a fit. And so in that case, yeah, if you're filling this thing out and you're like, you know what, these things don't seem to work together, they don't really make sense. Sometimes there's internal discrepancies, right? Like maybe they're selling something that's premium, a premium product, but there's no money that's devoted to marketing, right? And so that's just a disconnect. And so you can see that. And so while any one of those boxes aren't necessarily good or bad, it's the combination of them all that make it, it's got to make sense.
Right. Yeah, I was just thinking, I'd be pretty impressed if somebody like wasn't just taking away, that I'm interviewing them. They were actually trying to interview me as well, and had, a scorecard on all these categories of how our business is doing. But no, I think that's a great mindset that you brought into like now how you think about each startup you get involved in, and think about it as actually, joining in, and it is a partnership, when you become an investor in a company, and you have to make sure all the pieces in place are exactly what, you have the same vision for the company that the founder has, and there's some alignment there.
Yep.
So, and in terms of the types of businesses, I've heard both sides. Some people like to go into businesses they're really comfortable with and know that type of model or industry really well. Other people, the more you know it, they think like that discourages you from that technology. So, what's your philosophy on that?
My take on that is I tend to stick to spaces I do know a little bit better if I'm going to get deeply involved. And maybe I'll answer this a little bit more broadly, so it's not just like the way I behave, because I've talked to so many investors, both angels and institutional investors, of like how they treat deal flow and how they evaluate whether or not something's a good fit for them. We do find that often if you know a space really well, you tend to see all the bad things about the space. Now, if the space continues to grow, then fantastic, right? You're going to double down on it. But many of us have this sort of PTSD from a space where all we can see is the bad stuff. And so we know that in those cases, any bar that we're holding is just going to be that much higher for success, right? And so if it's something that's in travel or digital media, those are all things that I'm going to scrutinize a lot more. I try to grade appropriately. So in those cases, I know that I'm asking questions that are probably much deeper than other investors will be asking. And so I will give a little bit more slack in that example. The other piece to this is if the team has a gap where I have some sort of functional expertise that can help, that's also positive. And so if I'm a pro on the product and marketing side, and they know the tech side, or they know the business itself that I don't know, then that's great, right? It's complementary and something that I can do to help out. That's generally true for other investors as well. So I've heard lots of the, whether you bet on a space or you bet on a person, your own past experiences influence really greatly, like what investments you'll make.
Right. No, I think that's really good advice, and yeah, great way to break it down there as well. So, you mentioned a little bit about like some companies and, how you want to get more involved, and or there's certain areas you can help fill in the gaps? Like, what are the main areas outside of the investment that you're looking to get involved and help out the startups with?
Yeah, it's frequently whatever they actually need, and so maybe I'll turn it around a little bit. It's less the what can I do to help that startup. It's more about, as they're growing and their needs change, who can be the most helpful. And so it's a little bit like what you do, right? You connect the right people, and very, very quickly, I'm going to exhaust my immediate knowledge and immediate way that I can help. And so that might be like one or two conversations in where I'm like, oh, okay, I can point you in the right direction, or I can make a couple of suggestions. But beyond that, it's all about, as that startup evolves over time, maybe their first 6 months, the challenges around building the product, in which case then there'll be a certain set of people that'll be helpful. In the next 6 months, maybe it's about that very first customer, in which case that go-to-market challenge is totally different, right? It'll be a different set of people. And so it's frequently just staying on top of knowing what their gaps are, what their needs are at any particular time, and then finding the right people who can help out.
Perfect. Yeah, it's all about the, connecting to the right people in your network, and helping them at different stages. And you've experienced that side as well, like coming from the early stages through the TripAdvisors and E-Trades and PayPal's of the world at the end. And did you see a big, I guess, the companies you ended up working with that acquired your businesses, were they still did they still have an entrepreneurial mindset at the corporate level, or was it difficult, getting some of that innovation done and pushed out there that you were working on?
Yeah, that's something that can be pretty painful for a lot of founders that end up at other companies. And having been acquired a handful of times, there are different flavors. So in some cases, there's a tremendous amount of latitude that you're given. So when I was part of TripAdvisor, we were actually owned at the time by IAC and IAC Interactive Corp. And Expedia at some point later was like the parent company. But the nature of the interaction between the parent company and TripAdvisor was actually pretty fantastic. Like, for the most part, we were running a business that they expected us to just continue to grow, and we had sort of full control over that. But we just had the ability to tap into much deeper resources, right? And just, you got all these smart people, whether it's on the finance side or if it's the specific expertise on go-to-market, that was all available to us. And so that acquisition was very much a run the business as is. And there's other ones where the thesis around the acquisition is that you'll get deeply integrated with the parent company in some fashion. It might be integration on the product side. It could be integration for the way you go to market. It could be a sales thing, whatever that is, in which case it's naturally much more disruptive. But many of these companies also have done previous acquisitions. And so they tend to have this playbook of M&A, in which case then you fit in a certain way. And so there's just a lot of different models in terms of how companies behave. And it is, and to answer your question directly, some of them can continue to be innovative and they spin off these efforts, but there's just a much bigger machine. And so some people thrive in that and some people don't. And so it's difficult to know, upfront, who, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, who will be the stars in those companies. And in every one of these cases, when a company gets acquired, the people that you think are going to be the ones that leave right away, and the people who you think will be there for a long time, it is never who you think they are. And I don't know if it's just because you don't know upfront, or it's legitimately something that just changes over time, and so you cannot predict. And so maybe one takeaway from that is that, after acquisitions, you frequently are trying to figure out who the key people are to retain. And you get this sort of one shot, one slug way of keeping them, whether it's, through some sort of incentive or comp or whatever. And I guess the thing I've learned is that you want to try to keep that pocketbook as long as you can and dole that out over time, because it will change.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, because I think, yeah, and a lot of times, we're thinking about this as the, the corporations acquiring the startups, but it's also, a big decision as you grow as a company too. Maybe your startup is going to be the one acquiring other companies, and what do you do with the other teams? Who's going to stick around, and how do you manage that process of integrating everybody together? And oh yeah, looks like we had some people sharing contact and what they're working on in the chat. If you guys have any questions, feel free to submit them there as well. And then just to touch base on the fundraising and pitch side. First off, where do you end up meeting most of the founders? These that you end up investing in? Is it through the angel groups, or through I know you're pretty active on like Clubhouse and other channels and event groups and everything now. So I guess where do you like to meet founders, and sort of what's your typical process of moving from that first introduction through the investment phase?
Yeah, I may be a little unusual as an investor in this case, but I actually really love operating and building. And for the most part, the conversations I have with founders tend to gravitate in those directions rather than like the investment side. And so I think unlike some other angel investors that probably take angel investing, the sheer craft of investing, maybe even more seriously than I do, they actually really love the sourcing process, the looking at different companies. And so that's not something that I particularly love. And for the most part, I'm kind of passive when it comes to deal sourcing. So it's generally just people within my own network. I will occasionally, reach out and look for a particular industry or a particular kind of, space or something along those lines. And so when I do direct outreach, which is pretty rare, I'll have something in mind, and it's generally through some network or some people that I know. But for the most part, the way I get, I guess, deal flow, which is your question, a lot of it comes in directly. So they're just inbounds from people that I know. A lot of it comes in inbound from people I don't know. And so that's the Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram. I think every single messaging platform I've probably has been used to contact people, which drives me a little insane, right? Because like it's scattered all over the place. And so I get a lot of inbound that way. And then most of the rest of the really interesting opportunities are ones that are just like 1 degree away. And so it could be someone contacts you, or someone on this call jumps in and it's like, got this really interesting idea, and can I put in almost, and then full different groups that and as a result, you end up just seeing a lot of different stuff.
Then I think that ties, or it's jumping back a little bit, but ties well into a question Joseph asked here on, you've been, or sort of in between the two storylines here, what got you into that first investment when you said, I've never made an angel investment before, but I really like something about this particular startup that I want to go the investor pathway. What was that story?
Yeah, no, Joseph, thanks for asking the question. And maybe this is very consistent with what I shared earlier with this. It was a little haphazard, so it wasn't something I had intentionally done. In fact, I was interviewing for a job with a startup founder, and we were having coffee when that was a thing many years ago. And when we met, we were talking about the role, what the idea was. Sounded like it was a pretty cool idea. As I was filling out the little sheet and adding all of the details of the company. And by the time we got to the end, realized that the role that they had open just wasn't a great fit for me. I can't remember at the time what it was, but it wasn't really my skill set. But I left the meeting remembering that sounded like a really interesting business. And so I called them back a couple of days later, and turns out one of my former CEOs is also like deeply involved in the company, I think as an investor. And he had a pretty high bar in terms of just people that he would kick the tires quite a bit. And so for him to put in money, like he had done a lot of due diligence. It was interesting enough that I wrote a check into it, and my wife and I both actually wrote checks into that company. And so go figure, I as part of an interview for a company, end up walking out giving the other person the check. So maybe things not to do.
Well, you already had the scorecard, so you're
right.
halfway there on the investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's just save another half hour.
Exactly. Another question from Juliana on what you look for in terms of the traction in the startups that you're investing in.
Sure. That's also another very relevant question, and I'll answer it directly, but I'll also maybe make this more useful in terms of how a lot of other investors view that. In my case, traction is super helpful just because it defines the stage that the startup is at, right? The earlier the stage, the more it's about the founder and the idea. The later the stage, the more data that there is to be able to back that up. And so if you're maybe at the sort of ultimate late stage when an investment is in the public markets, you kind of don't really need to know much because it's in the market, it's being priced. You generally have a market pricing mechanism that figures out what the right price is. And so for the most part, do you buy it or not? And so that's kind of at the other end. And so for me, when I get involved in early stage companies, they don't have to have traction. Often it is about that idea and seeing the potential of seeing something larger than that. And a big difference is between, and maybe this is answering it generally, is that if you look at stages of investment and check sizes, they tend to go hand in hand. And so as founders go out and look for potentially good fitted investors, you want to keep that in mind, that there are sweet spots for check sizes, and you want to approach them appropriately, right? And so if you're seeking, as an example, 500,000 investment, and you're looking at taking checks from angels of that's 25,000 and above, then there's a certain range of angels you want to talk to. You don't want to talk to a Series B investor that's writing $30 million checks, right? That's kind of obvious, but can't tell you the number of times I've actually seen people that just sort of blurt out that they're fundraising. And so the B series investor will require a lot more traction. The seed investor will not. And so that's just something that you got to keep in mind as you go out and prospect.
And yeah, obviously it depends on, the industry and type of company a little bit, but are there certain minimum requirements? Say it's a tech, or, use some of your background in the travel tech and other technology space there. Is there something, at minimum you want to see in place by the time they reach out to you?
There really isn't. I guess if the visual in this case is that if you're looking at a potential investor and you have this range of checks that would be impactful for the round that you're raising, let's just use that $500,000 example again. So you're raising a $500,000 round. Let's say friends and family and colleagues, you've gotten 100 of the first 500, and you're still looking for 400. Then you do the math in terms of like, how many people do you want to talk to finish that 400? So it might be talking to one other big institution that'll fill it, right? That could be one strategy. One could be, let me find 10 angels all writing $40,000 checks. That would be a different strategy. You could approach something more like an equity crowdfunding thing or syndicate, in which case then the amount goes lower. And so all of those really kind of depend. And so in my case, my sweet spot angel investment has historically been sort of the 10 to 25K range. Some cases I write a little bit more, right? If it's something that really aligns and I do that much work. And sometimes I'll write less, especially if someone else does a lot of that work. And the way angel investing works these days is there's so many groups that are collaborating with each other. And so most of the checks that I write these days, some other people have been involved in the sourcing, in kicking tires, in talking to the founders, and frankly, they just know more about the space than I do. And so I'll frequently look to them, and if they're putting in some money, I'll do a quick check, in which case then traction doesn't really move the needle one way or another. And so some cases it's just the idea. There's no traction whatsoever. And in other cases, there's a ton of traction, and it's just like, okay, well, it's pretty obvious a lot of the risk has been wrung out of the investment, in which case then you make your investment.
Right. Yeah, and a couple questions that tie into one of the things you mentioned, or a couple of the comments you had mentioned earlier on, one of your, or a few different reasons you're angel investing, it sounded like. One is actually they're great, or what you see as good investments with the financial return potential, but also a way of what you described as like giving back and helping the founders. So on the topic of like impact investing, how important is or I guess, are there certain categories you're looking to make more of an impact in that affect your investment decision over others?
Yeah, and I guess I'll answer that. Apologies, there's a motorcycle next to me here, but I'll answer
Sure.
that in two different ways. The one way, I guess I'll just have to talk louder than the motorcycle. The one way is there are certainly industries that have this double bottom line impact, and some are the obvious ones around social impact, where it's doing just something that's good in the world, and so that will naturally be there's a bonus that's associated with that, and sometimes maybe that's alone enough to make that investment. In my case, all things being equal, I would like to see more stuff that has an impact on people in general. And so think of things in digital health and education and pure social. Those are all areas that I think we're actually underinvesting in all those areas. And so that's just, some place I'll lean into. Many of those places I don't have a ton of expertise, right? And so this is where I'm bringing other people to the table. But I do think broadly, if you look at just other investors, and there is a spectrum. And Jason, you were just describing that spectrum, which wasn't something you and I have talked about, but it just triggered a memory, which was, if you look at the spectrum from pure financial on one side and pure philanthropic on the other side, there's definitely people that are in different parts of that spectrum. And so there's a handful of angel investors that treat it very professionally, and they're like, you know what, this is my full-time job. I love what I do, but I'm going to treat it like a business, right? Where I'm looking for the best deals, I'm looking for the financial returns. Of course, things that have social impact, or all things being equal, they would like to do that, but their primary driver is around the financial return. And that's, they'll behave a certain sort of way, right? And think of them as if you go to like an institutional investment fund, investment firm, and you're looking for investment, they behave like that. It just happens to be their own money. And so that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum, you've got a ton of money, and at some point you just want to, like, this is the Bill Gates of the world, right? And so there's only a few people in that philanthropic category. Most other investors are somewhere in between, in the sense that they like what drives them. And I find that in that middle ground, there's like two personas. There's the persona of I'm betting on a particular space because I like the space, I know something about the space, and I want to be able to plug in more deeply. And so it's not completely altruistic, right? It's they want to learn more, and in that case, it's a great fit, right? If they bring some historical knowledge and they know the players and they can help that startup, and now they're fresh, the investor's now fresher in the topic, and so fantastic. That's one flavor. And then the other persona flavor is that the one I described before, which was, if the startup has a gap that you're able to uniquely fill, whether or not you know that space, then I see a lot of investors get involved in that sense. That also bleeds over to people that become advisors to startups, like that middle, that last category of someone that's like, and I've got a ton of technical expertise, and this team knows about the business. Like, how can I help? They frequently become much more hands-on in the business, and so that's just like a whole other flavor. But that whole spectrum exists, and when you talk to an investor, try to get a feel for like where they exist on that.
I think that, that spectrum and the way you put it, really helps visualize it there. And definitely, it's not like a black and white scenario. It's a lot of different reasons
hopefully
people
that was
are
useful.
investing.
I know that was not the question, but I figured I would throw that out there since it could be useful.
No, I think that was great. Oh yeah, and then a question from John about basically on the post-pandemic, and also to add on to that too, like how have you seen how you interact, or how the type of deals, or anything changed throughout the pandemic that you're looking at on the investment side, and do you see that continuing after the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and I've thought about this and I've tracked this somewhat closely, is that initially when the pandemic hit, it changed. It was a shock to a lot of the early stage ecosystem, and I saw some valuations were kicked downward, right? And so it was just, you had to plan for longer runways. And so initially it seemed like there was this 20 or 30% hit, and kind of saw that throughout. We've gotten to the point now where I think valuations have come back up, and there are certainly some businesses where this was an accelerant, right? Think of things like mobile payment, right? And so wherever their historical trajectory was, it's now on a different path. And so the pandemic has basically given this couple of these industries like telehealth and remote learning a boost. And so what I don't know is whether or not when things return to a little bit more normal, does that mean things drop, right? And so is this just a one-time boost, a one-time catalyst, or are there structural changes that are actually going to stay post-pandemic? And that, no one really knows. At least I don't really know. And there's maybe others that are on this call that do, but that's one thing. And then the other piece to this is, as an investor post-pandemic, what I've seen is that people at the early stages are now much more used to being able to, or comfortable with, meeting people online. And it's kind of an obvious thing, but historically at the earliest stages, there was this kind of rule of thumb where you had to be generally located near those early stage investors, because the venture changes a lot, the pivots happen all the time. And so there was this, like, you had to be somewhere near that. But now it doesn't matter if you're 3 feet away in the next car, if you're 3,000 miles away. And so people are definitely much more, on the investor side, much more comfortable with that. And I expect that to continue, because now you can actually source from other places, and this barrier of physical location is somewhat removed, right? And so I think that will stay post-pandemic.
Right. Yeah, it's that whatever 4-hour drive, or however whatever the limits are, used to be more of a thing, and now if you're a Zoom call away, you're a Zoom call away.
Yeah. And it's a pro and a con,
it'll be
right?
interesting to see if that continues.
Yeah, in some cases it's a good, in some cases it's not, not so good. Like I think some of the barriers have been eroded. Now there's clearly still going to be, if you're selling to a particular kind of customer and the customer is really located in one place, then of course you probably still want to be in that location. But I think when it comes to the investing side, it's less the case. And in general, I'm just a huge fan of Boston. And so regardless of whether or not I can now meet with someone digitally, virtually, as opposed to meeting them live, I still will have a preference to ventures that are based out of this region. So that's regardless of how I end up talking to the entrepreneurs. But that's just me personally.
Yeah, because I think there's still going to be, I guess this will be a discussion too, but between different cities, we're here in Boston, there's a big biotech, healthcare, and technology scene here. Other cities have other specialties that more of the startups focus on, and even the investment mindset I've seen a little bit differently, and care a little bit more about the valuation and hitting certain milestones in Boston versus more of the Silicon Valley mindsets a little bit differently, and getting as much capital in early on and just seeing where it ends up. So I guess, do you think those differences city to city are going to continue, or more of those barriers going to break down as well?
I think those will continue. I think in spaces where location is less of a factor, like software can be written anywhere. The erosion of these physical limitations is probably a good thing, right? Just in general, you're going to be able to source talent differently. You'll be able to build businesses differently. I think many of the fields that you just mentioned, like life sciences and hardware and robotics, so those are ones where you physically have to be somewhere and you have to do something, and it involves bits, right? Not bytes. And so in those cases, the locations will still be really critical, right? And not just location for your colleagues, it's like location to customers, partners, other resources, physical space, all those things don't go away. And so those will continue to be geographically bound.
It makes sense to me. And then, yeah, are there any investments you've made along the way that have sort of changed your mindsets or added additional like rules to your chart that you put together? Of like, we need to have this in place, or this is something I should be looking at deeper?
Yeah, I guess I would like to say that I should be a little bit more methodical when it comes to that. And you'd think that being a former software engineer, I would be, but I have found over time, I'm probably less systematic about investing in the criteria, and it's not because there's better pattern recognition, right? I will be the first to say my pattern recognition is terrible on that. I think at this stage, again, this is more of a personal preference than anything else. At this stage, I'm focused so much on the founders and the spaces themselves that the act of investing is like a little bit of a side thing. And for the most part, the criteria that I would use to evaluate them just seems kind of overweight, right? Like it just seems like it's just too much structure and too much work, especially at the early stages. And so for the most part, as I've invested in companies, I've become more loose, I guess, when it comes to the criteria. And that's something I should just know, right? But then, I'm writing checks that don't, they're not massive checks where I really should do a ton of homework. And so in some cases, it's the 3 people I trust that know the space really well. They've done their homework. They're jazzed about it. They've worked with the founder in the past, and I have an opportunity to put a little bit of money alongside, and like, okay, great. I'll take a quick look and make sure it doesn't have any red flags, and then put in a little bit of money. And so I think if anything, I'm optimizing for volume as opposed to like a smaller number and higher precision.
And once you go into an investment, like what excites you the most, hearing their updates? And is there something you're looking for, outside of obviously all the investments, you're looking for, an exit and a return on them, but along the way, what are you looking for and hoping to hear from the startups you go into?
Yeah, I usually skip right to the ask section of the updates. And so if any of the folks here are working on early stage startups, you probably have a set of folks that you keep up to date every now and then, and that periodic update is something that you're likely sending, whether it's monthly or quarterly, whatever frequency. There's generally a section on the bottom that says like, how you can help. And so I kind of skip to that. And maybe that's, again, just the sheer volume. I think if I only had like 5 or 6 investments, I would pour through them and much more carefully. I think frequently I am just trying to figure out what's the quickest way I'm able to add some value. And so I'll skip to that section and just kind of run with it. And I think, I'm not, you write these investments, the immediate driver is not, how do I maximize the value like today, right? And how do I liquidate this? And so it's just a long-term game. So you're just trying to figure out how you can be helpful along the way.
Yeah, I want to touch on that a little bit because, we might have some, or I know like we have some early stage founders who might be writing some of their first investor updates now. And, so the ask isn't just, it's not just like what's going on the fundraising side. What are some of the other areas, you see getting put in that, like, how can I help, or how can the investors help in these updates that are getting sent to you?
There are So it depends on your stage, right? So if you're a very early stage, the type of updates you're sending are likely a lot less detailed than when you're at later stages. There's a couple of great blog posts out there. I think if you just Google startup update template, you're going to see ones that Techstars, YC, a couple investors have also, and so just look for one that generally works for you. I think the important thing here is that there's no one right way to do it. Just find one that covers generally what you are like, what you want to cover at the stage that you're at. And so so I just see a lot of different kinds, and that doesn't bother me, right? They all have a different kind of flavor to them. And so I think if you're making those updates these days, find that one and stick with it until it doesn't work. Like maybe in a year or two from now, like you're finding that, you know what, I'm asking something different, but you'll end up evolving it over time.
I think that's that's great. Yeah, so on the let's see. Yeah, we have a question here from. Sorry,
That's right. I can
scrolled up automatically.
I can do it.
Anyways.
I see a couple questions. You got Joseph and John and Joseph again, and we could do a speed round. So, question: willing to share
Sure.
the group? How many successes have you had in all investments? Yeah, happy to share it. Angel investing is definitely a spotty kind of activity. Out of 10 investments, you're generally shooting for is like one that's the home run that'll return 10x, and you'll have a couple others that will return maybe 2 to 3x, and you have a bunch that are zeros across the board. It's just the nature of early stage investments as opposed to late stage investments. And so out of the 60 or so, many of them have been more recent. I'd say about half of those were written in the last 2 years. And so you just don't know, right? Because they sit in a state where the typical angel investment runs, 5 to 7 years kind of thing. And so those are all TBD. And for the ones that are older, there's a handful of winners. I had a few that were in the 20x plus range, a few that were in like the 5x plus range, a few that just barely returned investors' money, and then the majority of the other ones they're zeros, right? They go to zero, and so it's just something that you have to be comfortable with. And maybe this brings it full circle as to when I read those investor updates, I don't know if that one's going to zero, in which case then I'm just trying to help out for the most part. And so that's that question. And I actually post all my angel investments on my own site. So if you go to davidchang.me/investments, you'll see all those investments there. And then question from John, so Jason, if it's okay, I'm just reading down the chat. John's currently raising as an early stage entrepreneur. Good. One investor said is investing not because he thinks that there will be return, but because there's an alignment of values. Is it a good or bad thing? Should I accept this money? That's because the dog wants you to take the money, but I don't think it's a bad thing. So what I think I would do in this case is, if that investor has written a bunch of checks before, find out how frequent, ideally contact another investor another entrepreneur that investor has invested in, right? Because you just get a flavor. So you're basically doing some background checking on him, which is fine. And so in that case, you may find that they're great. You may find something that's around a red flag. I think just the sheer investing because of alignment of values is more positive than negative. The only red flags that would give me is just to make sure that doesn't imply that or that the investor is just inexperienced, or I think the worst thing you want to do is like get money from someone that will then cause some pain down the road. And I think the only way you can figure that out is to do some homework as to how this person typically invests. So I think this is more a good than a bad thing. And then Joseph's question: do you only give funding, or would you give needed equipment or other resources to funding? And so, in my case, as I mentioned earlier on, so much of what drives me is just working with founders. And I would say out of random number, but out of 100 people I talk to, maybe 30 of them, and let's say 100 people looking for funding, maybe 30 of them would be ones that I can immediately be helpful and would be a potential fit with some vehicle or some group of people that I know, right? And so if you whittle that down, the other 70 are ones where I'm just trying to point them in the right direction. And in terms of equipment, I don't really have equipment. As you can tell, I'm sitting in my car. And other resources, it's typically around just making connections, right? And so for the 30, where I can help out, I'd say I'm leaning in maybe that next level of detail, which is let me make a bunch of intros. And out of those 30, probably 25 of them are ones where my interaction with them just ends at that point. And so they, I would have done a couple, hopefully some good connections. They go off and they do their thing. And maybe some of the connections are around investors. Sometimes maybe it's around customers, maybe it's around advice, around hiring, whatever that is. And so out of 100 people that I talk to, there's only 5 that I end up getting to that next level where it might be something that's particularly relevant in terms of like my own investment thesis and background, or someone that I directly know where I'm deeply involved, like the TBD Angels group that I had mentioned. And so, so hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of a flavor for, how frequently that happens.
Yeah, and then no, I think that was I really like that, everything you've tied together in this in this conversation so far. I mean, we started on your entrepreneurial pathway, what you're looking for in different investments, what excites you about one versus another, and a lot of tips to companies that can sort of what you're looking for and what other investors are going to be looking for, that sets you apart from everything. So in terms of, I guess, if you had to, give one piece of advice for somebody, I'd say, an early stage tech company going out, maybe if they have any funding at all, might be some friends and family or individual angels, and now like going out for a more formalized round. What's one thing you don't see everybody doing that really impresses you when the founder, comes to you with this one piece of advice?
Yeah, I'm tempted to give a ridiculously long answer, but I won't. And so all I'll say is there's a pretty good playbook for how to fundraise and the tactics around that. And I'll pluck one thing out of that, which I don't see a lot of founders doing particularly well, which is the socialization part. And so I found that very frequently as a founder, you can achieve more if you carve off a 2 to 3 month period where you're not explicitly fundraising. And it's a little bit trite, but it's that adage of when you want money, ask for advice. When you want advice, ask for money. There's something about the dynamic and the psychology of investors that if during this socialization period, you can go out and talk about your idea, but not actually make that ask, I find that that completely changes the dynamic between you and the prospective investor. And so there's 3 key benefits that come out of that. One is that you end up creating a much higher conversion rate, right? And so if we've never met before and you give me your pitch and you ask for money right away, the likelihood I'm going to say yes is really low, right? So say 2%. But if out of that conversation, you're like, I'm not raising yet, here's my idea. Here are the smart, who do you think I should talk to? How can you be helpful? The likelihood you'll get something useful out of me goes from 2% to like 30%, right? So it increases quite a bit. Number 2, it gives you reasons to go back to that investor and say, 3 weeks from now, I did something. Hey, that was great advice. Now let me give you an update on the business. You've created like some data points over time. And then the third reason to do that is that you control your shot clock. And so frequently founders that make this mistake, they have this endless fundraising cycle where it seems like they're continuously trying to raise that first round and they can never close it. And because the venture and angel community is small, the perception is that the deal is stale. And so you just want to control your own clock. And so if you do that socialization piece, you can start raising when you actually are ready to raise. And so that's what that socialization piece gives you.
Oh, that's good. That's amazing. Yeah, I think, actually getting to know, getting to know founders and investors as people, and, even what you sort of that same advice on, as like what excited you to join a company at the beginning, you're using to figure out what excites you, to join as an investor, and the startups should be doing the same thing. So Yeah, Tom wanted to know what the name of the book or the playbook is that you mentioned.
It's less of a, it's, yeah, Tom, good to see you there. It's less of a book. It's more of a sort of, I guess, collected set of best practices. And sorry, I use the term playbook, and so it's not actually a book. It's a presentation I've given a handful of times about how to raise your first round, and so I just posted it on my website, which is davidchang.me.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm going to post your website in the chat, davidchang.me, and definitely also check out, we have some more upcoming startup grind events. We actually have one next Thursday as well. I think it's Thursday, with JD from Oracle, who's one of their the Oracle for Startups leads of their program. And yeah, excited about that. We have a couple other ones we're going to be putting on the calendar shortly. You can also check our sponsors and partners, including Brex and ShipQuid. You know, some more information on those. And yeah, really excited. You know, everybody came out here today, and David, you did an amazing job on our chat. Excited to share this on our the Startup Grind Global YouTube channel, and you know, showcase to all the other chapters as well that, you know, can come and check it out. And yeah, and if anybody has any other areas we can help out with, you know, any introductions from here, or yeah, anything you know, you want connections and resources to from Startup Grind, feel free to reach out and be happy to help.
Jason, well, thanks for creating the space for all of us to get together, and thanks for everyone for jumping in and chatting a little bit of entrepreneurship and investing.
That was great. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, you know, if there's ever anything else you know, we can help with, feel free to let me know. And no, really appreciate you giving your time today.
Thank you, David.
Good to be here.
Thank you, Jason.